Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses as we continue with Chapter 9, Masonry, from Francis Bacon and His Secret Society, by Mrs. Henry Pott. Chapter 9, Masonry. If I mistake in those foundations which I build upon, the center is not strong enough to bear a schoolboy's top. Winter's Tale. According to many books on Freemasonry, the Rosicrucians had no connection with the Masonic fraternity. In the face of collective evidence to the contrary, it is very difficult for non-Masonic people to credit the statement. It would rather seem as if the desire of Masonic writers to draw a hard and fast line between the two societies were confirmatory of hints dropped in certain books concerning schisms which, during the last 2 centuries, have occurred amongst the brethren or brotherhoods. Originally one and the same, alike in aims, alike in symbolic language, with similar traditions tracing back to similar origins, some at least of the members supposed to have constituted the Rosicrucian society actually were, we find, members of the Freemason Lodge. The only conspicuous differences which appear to have existed 300 years ago were, 1, that the Rosicrucians were distinctly Christian and church people, and that the magnificent literature brought out under their auspices was all either religious or written with an elevating tendency, invariably loyal, patriotic, and unselfish. 2, that the society was unostentatious and retiring to such an extent as to gain the name of the Invisible Brotherhood. It labored silently and secretly for the good of men, but not to be seen of men. It went not to church with brass bands and banners, neither did it assume magniloquent titles or garments and decorations of obsolete or grotesque quaintness. The Rosicrucians were and are a powerful but unobtrusive Christian literary society. The Freemasons are, we believe, the lower orders of the same, deists, but not necessarily Christians, moral but not necessarily religious, bent on benefiting the human race, by all means humanitarian, and chiefly devoting themselves to the development of the practical side of life, to architecture, printing, medicine, surgery, etc. To the arts and crafts, the habitations, the recreations of the million. It is easy to see that in the first instance, such societies might have worked as part of one system. Whether or not they continue in any degree so to work, we cannot positively say, but it seems to the mere looker-on as if, once one, the society divided, subdivided, and in its lower branches underwent such changes as to be not only divergent, but at the present day different in character and aim. We speak, hoping to be contradicted, and give as an instance that the Freemasonry of Germany seems to differ very much from that of the most respectable lodges of England, being in some cases not only not Christian, but not even deistic. On the contrary, persons professedly atheists are enrolled amongst its members, and this miserable degradation of the brotherhood has, we are told, unhappily extended to England and America. Need it be said that to atheism and irreligion is too frequently added the so-called socialism, which has in these later days done so much to stir up discontent where content reigned, destroying order and respect for authority, and setting men by the ears who should be joined for mutual aid. Of course, this is the bad and dark side of the question. There is a very bright side too, and researches, we cannot say inquiries, for they are fruitless, encourage us to hope that there are signs either of the drawing together of opposite parties, for which Bacon so earnestly strove, or else that the much suppressed Rosicrucians, the gallant little band who held together through all the stormy times of the Puritans, the civil wars, the Restoration, and the many subsequent troubles, are now rapidly multiplying in number, increasing in power, and everywhere extending their beneficent operations. By their fruits ye shall know them. But all this is, after all, mere conjecture. It is only submitted as such in order that others may pin down these statements, proving or disproving them. Having no means of doing so, we fall back for the present upon our old plan of quoting the best authorities. And when, as is frequently the case, these doctors disagree, readers will perhaps cross-examine them and decide between them. Dr. Mackey is positive that the Rosicrucians have no connection with the Masons. He is indignant that anyone should doubt this. Notwithstanding this fact, says the doctor, but bringing no proof of the fact, Barnell, the most malignant of our revilers with a characteristic spirit of misrepresentation, attempted to identify the two institutions. This is an error into which others might unwittingly fall from confounding the Prince of Rosicrucian, a Masonic degree somewhat similar in name but entirely different in character. Here again, it is not explained how the writer has become so intimately acquainted with the characteristics of the Rosicrucians, seeing that he is not himself an initiate of that brotherhood. He proceeds in the same strain of assertion without proof. The Rosicrucians do not derive their name, like Rosicrucian Masons, from the rose and cross, for they have nothing to do with the rose, but with the Latin rose, dew, and crux the cross as a hieroglyphic of light. A Rosicrucian philosopher is one who, by the assistance of dew, previously explained as the most powerful solvent of gold, seeks for light or the philosopher's stone. This author is evidently possessed with the notion that there is something rather discreditable in Rosicrucianism, for he concludes with an apology for having introduced the subject, which only a fear of the error into which Masons might unwittingly fall would apparently have induced him to touch upon. Another work of the same kind has a long article on Rosicrucianism, in which all the old traditions and errors are repeated, that the Rosicross brethren were alchemists, that their origin was of great antiquity, etc., adding also other errors, namely that the fraternity seldom had meetings together, and that its corporate character was by no means marked. The writer, who evidently takes a much more correct view of the aims of the society than his predecessor, yet adds this statement: the modern society of Rosicrucians is constituted upon a widely different basis than that of the parent society. While the adepts of former times were contented with the knowledge of their mutual obligations and observed them as a matter of course and custom, the 18th century Rosicrucians forced the world to think that, for a time, they were not only the precursors of Masonry, but in essentia, that body itself. This has led to many misconceptions. With Freemasonry, the occult fraternity has only this much to do. That is, that some of the Rosicrucians were also Freemasons, and this idea was strengthened by the fact that a portion of the curriculum of a Rosicrucian consisted in theosophy. These bodies had, however, no other substantial connective ties. In fact, Freemasons have never actually laid claim to the possession of alchemical secrets. Starting from a definite legend, that of the building of Solomon's temple, they have merely moralized on life, death, and the resurrection. But this, we know, is the same definite legend from which the Rosicrucians started, and they moralized after the same fashion and in the same strictly Baconian manner, metaphorically and by analogy, or as our author here formidably puts it, correspondentially with the increase and decrease and the palingenesia of nature. He pays a proper tribute to the superiority of the Rosicrucians over the Freemasons when he says that as the science of mathematics contains the rude germs of things, and the science of words comprehends the application of these forms and intellectual purification, so the Rosicrucian doctrine specifically pointed out the uses and interrelations between the qualities and substances in nature, although their enlarged ideas admitted of a moral survey. The Freemasons, while they have deserved the esteem of mankind for charity and works of love, have never accomplished, and by their inherent sphere of operation never can accomplish what these isolated students effected. But although the extent and precise nature of the connection between the two societies may not be accurately definable, though indeed it may be unknown excepting to a select few in the very highest degree of initiation, yet the ceremonies and symbols of this degree of Prince Rosicrucian approach more nearly to those of the Rosy Cross Brotherhood than they do even to other degrees of their own Masonic lodges. For the Rosicrucian alone, of all the degrees in Masonry, is said by the best authorities to be eminently a Christian degree, and hence unattainable by an immense number of Masons. We observe, moreover, that the monk mentioned by the Masonic writer whom we are about to cite is none other than our old friend Johann Valentin Andreas, the formerly accredited author of The Chemical Marriage of Christian Rosencreutz, which we now find to have been written by Francis Bacon at the age of 15. It will also be observed in the following extracts that Ragan attributes to Andreas the same motive for inaugurating the secret society as that which chiefly influenced Bacon, the grief, namely which he felt at the loss of truth through vain disputes and pedantic pride. Clavel, as we shall see, adds another thread to strengthen the evidence which we have collected to show that, whilst on the one hand the Rosicrucians were bound in every way to oppose the bigotry and superstition of the Church of Rome and the anti-Christian pretenses of the Pope to infallibility, yet it was not the Church of Rome, or its chief head or Pope, against which the Rosy Cross brothers were militant. It was against the errors, the bigotry and superstition which that church indulged in, against the ignorance and darkness in which the mass of its members were intentionally kept by its priesthood. The highly cultivated and sometimes heavenly-minded members of the Society of Jesus must doubtless have often had reason to share the distress attributed to the monk Andreas. And we think that it will probably be found that the Rosy Cross brethren did, in fact, obtain great, though secret, help from the more liberal amongst the Jesuit communities. Regan, in his treatise entitled Orthodoxie Magonique, attributes the origin of the 18th degree, or the sovereign prince of Rose-Croix heredom, to a pious monk named John Valentine Andreas, who flourished in the early part of the 17th century, and who wrote, amongst other works, two treatises, one entitled Judicorum de Fraternitate R.C., the other Noces Chimiques de Rosicrucians. Regan says that Andreas grieved at seeing the principles of Christianity forgotten in idle and vain disputes, and that science was made subservient to the pride of man, instead of contributing to his happiness, passed his days in devising what he supposed to be the most appropriate means of restoring each to its legitimate moral and benevolent tendency. Clavel absurdly affirms that the degree was founded by the Jesuits for the purpose of counteracting the insidious attacks of freethinkers upon the Romish faith. But he offers no evidence in support of his assertion. In fact, the Jesuits were the great enemies of Masonry, and so far from supporting it, wrote treatises against the order. Many of the Rosicrucians were amongst the reformers of the age, and hence the hostility of the Romish Church. The almost universal recognition of this degree in all countries would favor the theory of its being of long standing. Hurd, in his treatise on religions, speaks of the Brethren of the Rose, or Ne Plus Ultra. They were to declare openly that the Pope was Antichrist, and that the time would come when they should pull down his triple crown. They claimed a right of naming their successors and bequeathing to them all their privileges, to keep the devil in subjection, and that their fraternity could not be destroyed because God always opposed an impenetrable cloud to screen them from their enemies. Rossetti, in his work on the anti-papal spirit of Italy, asserts similar statements with regard to this and other societies connected with Freemasonry. The ceremonies of the degree of the Rose-Croix are of the most imposing and impressive character, and it is eminently a Christian degree. Its ritual is remarkable for elegance of diction, while the symbolic teaching is not only pleasing, but consistent with the Christian faith, figuratively expressing the passage of man through the valley of the shadow of death, accompanied and sustained by the Masonic virtues, faith, hope, and charity, and his final reception into the abode of light, life, and immortality. In the Rose-Croix transparency which is used during the ceremonies, there is a cross of Calvary raised on 3 steps. On the cross is hung a crown of thorns with one large rose in the center. 2 smaller crosses are on either side with skulls and crossbones. These symbols would alone be almost sufficient to satisfy our readers of the Christian character of that degree. But the jewel worn by the initiate is even more distinct in its announcement. This jewel includes all the most important symbols of the degree. It is a golden compass, extended on an arc to 22.5 degrees, or the 16th part of a circle. The head of the compass is surmounted by a crown with 7 emerald points. The compass encloses a cross of Calvary formed of rubies or garnets, having in its center a full-blown rose whose stem twines round the lower limb of the cross. At the foot of the cross is a pelican, wounding her breast to feed her young, which are in a nest beneath. On the reverse is an eagle instead of the pelican, and on the arc of the circle is engraved in cipher the password of the degree. Taking all things together, evidence favors the following conclusions with regard to the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons. 1. That the aims of the Freemasons are, in a lower degree, much the same as those of the Rosicrucians. 2, that the Masons begin by meeting on a common platform of humanity, and that they propose to raise their initiates step by step to a somewhat higher level. 3, that their highest level is a kind of theosophy or deism, or at least that no more than this is required, excepting in the Rose-Croix degree. Here the Rosicrucians, therefore, seem to part from them and to continue to mount. Whereas with the Freemasons, Christ and his church are practically ignored, with the Rosicrucians, Christianity is the life and soul of all that they have done and are doing. Whereas the words Christ, church, religion are almost banished from Freemason books, the mighty literature of the 16th and 17th centuries and all that is good, great, and enduring in the present age will probably be traced to the agency of this universal church literary society. 4. There seems to be no evidence that Freemasonry, in the present acceptation of the term, or as a mutual benefit society, existed before the middle of the 16th century. Church architects and builders who had secrets of their own and to whom probably we owe the magnificent structures which continue to be models to our own time were a trade guild and a church guild too. Their secrets were of the nature of the printer's secrets of the present day, not only for mutual use and protection, but also enclosing certain information to their craft and perhaps to a select few beyond that enchanted circle. But in no way can we say that these old builders filled the places of the ubiquitous, many-headed Freemasons. Moreover, if we mix them up with the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, we still find ourselves linked with the Holy Catholic Church of our forefathers, to which the Rosicrucians were inseparably bound, but from which the Freemason writers seem most anxious to separate themselves. Hepworth Dixon tells us that the scheme which Sir Nicholas Bacon presented to Henry VIII for the endowment of a school of law, policy, and languages in London was, perhaps, the original germ of the new Atlantis, the idea being transferred from statecraft to nature. It is therefore possible that Francis Bacon, whose admiration and reverence for his father is very perceptible, may have considered that the foundation stone of his Solomon's house was laid by Sir Nicholas. Nowhere can we find irrefutable statements or proofs that this society had any earlier history. The professed records of its antiquity seem, like the similar records of the Rosicrucians, to be fictitious, mere shams, which cannot pass current amongst initiated readers, playing upon words intended to convey to some members a knowledge or reminder of their true origin, whilst veiling it from the profane vulgar. The object of this concealment was probably the same as with the greater mysteries of the Rosicrucians, and twofold. It enabled the society to work more freely and unsuspected of dangerous or reforming aims. It also bestowed upon the fraternity a fictitious dignity and importance by the glamour shed over its ceremonies of a supposed antiquity, which, as Bacon shows, men are prone to adore. For in history, as in other matters, we often see 'tis distance lends enchantment to the view. Moreover, Freemasonry frequently lay under the charge of irreligion, not always without cause. Yet the goodness of the institution should not be rashly maligned because of the wickedness or weakness of some of its members, and its authorities come forward to defend it from this charge. Masonry is not an irreligious institution, but it assumes no special dogmatic form. It demands at the hands of its candidates a sincere and honest belief in a creative being, ever attentive to the honorable aspirations of those who seek him in spirit and in truth. And it rejects with scorn those who would degrade the contriver into a part of the contrivances, and thus would set bounds to the limitless author of all being. The estimation in which the Masons hold themselves is so amusing to non-Masons, and their traditions concerning themselves so quaint, that we cannot refrain from quoting a few passages. Freemasonry is undoubtedly the oldest society in the world, and it is not a political but a religious society, strange as such an assertion must be to the uninitiated. Before letters were invented, the only means of teaching divine truths and handing down divine traditions was by symbols and signs. In that way, before the deluge, the people of the old world had the whole history of the creation, the fall of our first parents, etc., handed down to them by tradition in the primitive lodges, the serpent being a common symbol employed for the purpose then, as it has been since. After the deluge, the ark became one of the commonest symbols, and the history of that event was thereby taught to the initiated. A lodge must have been in full working order on the plains of Shinar during the lifetime of Noah, for when the dispersion took place, lodges of a similar nature were established in every part of the world, though probably not for many years after the settlement of the emigrants in their new countries. They all, however, used the same symbols, and it has generally been admitted by scholars that they had one common origin. That common origin was Freemasonry. According to the traditions of our venerable society, Enoch was a very eminent Mason and preserved the true name of God, which the Jews subsequently lost. The descendants of Abraham write it Jau. In the mysteries it was Om, but most commonly expressed in a triliteral form, Aum, as we learn from Wilkins's notes on Bhagavad Gita. Both in the genuine and spurious lodges, the doctrine of a trinity and unity was taught. The mysteries, or spurious Masonic rites, were introduced into India by Brahma, into Egypt by Thoth, into China and Japan by Buddha, into Persia by Zarathustra, that is Zoroaster, into Greece by Melampus, according to Herodotus II, or by Cadmus, according to Epiphanius, into Boeotia by Prometheus, into Samothrace by Dardanus, into Crete by Minos, into Athens by Erechtheus, into Thrace by Orpheus, into Italy by Pelasgus, into Gaul and Britain by Gomer, into Scandinavia by Odin, into Mexico by Witzifsti, Perch 810, and into Peru by Manco Capac. There is no date to the little tract at the British Museum from which these extracts are made, but it seems to be of recent production and continues throughout in the same strain, assuming that because ancient symbols are introduced into Masonic language and ceremonies, therefore Masonry is of extremist antiquity. This same line of argument is adopted in many books which seem to be of Freemason extraction, and in some of the modern anti-Christian works on Buddhism and Theosophy. These go farther still, maintaining not only the superior antiquity, but the superior beauty and value of the religions of India and Arabia, which, well suited as they doubtless were to the rude or ignorant minds which they were to impress, can only be regarded by Christians as gropings before daylight, or as the altars erected by ignorant but well-meaning worshippers of the unknown God. In the ancient mysteries, all sorts of uncomfortable methods were resorted to in order to test the nerves and constancy of the initiate. He was made suddenly to see great lights, which were as suddenly eclipsed, leaving him plunged in total darkness. Terrible sounds and sights were in succession forced upon him. Thunder and lightning, visions of hideous monsters and horrible objects were designed to fill him with awe and consternation. Finally, he was restored to daylight and to a delightful calm in a lovely garden, where music and dancing revived his spirits and perhaps charmed him the more by reason of all the horrors to which he had been subjected. It seems to have been held as a crime, punishable only by death, for a man to reveal what he had seen in these mysteries, which for ages were kept secret. But as with the somewhat similar ordeals which are said to be imposed upon Masonic initiates, the secrets which now seem to us foolish and almost cruel have leaked out by some means or another. In the present day, such things appear to be anachronisms and profane rather than impressive. Nevertheless, they would doubtless have an effect on weak nerves, and may possibly aid in deterring the lower orders of initiates from revealing these secrets, or others of greater importance. In all cases, initiation represents death, and a renaissance or renovation, a new birth, not a resurrection from the dead. In the British mysteries, the novitiate passed the river of death in the boat of Garan here, the Charon of antiquity. The boat typified the corporal body, and before he could be admitted to this privilege, it was requisite that he should be mystically buried as well as mystically dead, which is implied in the ancient Greek formulary, I was covered in the bed, the body being a sort of grave or bed of the spirit. With the Freemasons, this symbolic death and burial is or was initiated by the ceremony of putting the novitiate into a coffin and covering him with a pall. We have heard, but cannot answer for the fact of a young man who fainted under this nerve test. It is hard to conceive that such things should be done in civilized countries at the present hour, and if it be true that they are yet practiced, it must be that vows taken by the initiates bind them to continue a system which, at its first invention, had some use in conveying certain instruction to very rude minds, incapable of otherwise receiving it. The earliest Rosicrucian documents do not enforce the special doctrines of any church. The later documents are, however, professedly Christian. We know that Bacon was religious, well able to render a reason of the hope which was in him. that he conformed to the ordinances of the Christian religion, that he died in the communion of the Church of England, and the thought suggests itself that during the period of his life when he was running through the whole round of the ancient philosophies, a terrible and unsettling process to young, excitable minds, at that time when his ardent soul was striving after definite truth and trying to free itself from the clouds of error, bigotry, and superstition which obscured it, he may have found himself, like Malvolio, more puzzled than the Egyptians in their fog. Besides this, the quarrels and division on religious questions sorely disturbed him. He could not believe in the religion of men who hated each other, who would dash the first table against the second, and who would so act as Christians as to make us forget that they are men. Such divisions, he says, were evils unknown to the heathen, yet he lived in the very midst of such divisions. He was 11 years old at the time of the massacre of St. Bartholomew, when 60,000 Huguenots or Protestants were butchered by the order of Charles IX. And his mother, the victims including Admiral de Coligny, one of the most virtuous men that France possessed, and the mainstay of the Protestant cause. He was a child when the tyranny and barbarity of the Inquisition was in full force, and for 31 years of his life he was witness to the scenes of intolerable cruelty and iniquity which were perpetrated under the name of religion by the Spanish Tiberius, Philip II, not only in his own country and amongst the unhappy Moors, but almost worse in Flanders or the Netherlands, where the miserable Protestants, at first patient under the extravagant oppression to which they were subjected, at last rebelled, and, at the sight of the tribunals of the Inquisition erected in their principal cities, forgot their own weakness, and, impelled by rage and fury, pulled down churches, subverted altars, and obliged the clergy to fly. The atrocities which followed, the execrable cruelties which were committed, and the detestation of the papists which was inspired in the formerly peaceable Flemings, are matters of history. No one will read Motley's graphic narrative of the events of this time and marvel that a thoughtful man witnessing such scenes should be led to doubt if religion, if Christianity, in whose name such deeds of darkness were performed, could be a true thing. In the Essay of Unity, Bacon speaks of Lucretius, the poet, who, when he beheld the act of Agamemnon that could endure the sacrificing of his own daughter, exclaimed, "Could religion prompt to deeds so dreadful?" What would he have said if he had known of the massacre in France or the powder treason in England? He would have been 7 times more epicure and atheist than he was. But Bacon seems to have said to himself, "Since men thus quarrel over their religious opinions, I will seek for some ground upon which all mankind may meet in common consent and harmony. All men who have any claim to intelligence and goodness acknowledge the existence of a God, an all-wise, all-powerful being, to whom we must render an account of ourselves. Let us then leave quarreling and controversies and meet as men and brethren on this wide platform of belief in a God and desire to benefit each other." Some such sentiment seems certainly to have been in the mind of the founder of Masonry, and perhaps the method adopted in rude times for enlisting the sympathies of the majority of ignorant but intelligent persons of various nationalities and creeds was the best that could be devised. There is no doubt that to the great society of the Freemasons we owe a vast debt of gratitude for the many humanitarian works which they have inaugurated, for the many fair houses for purposes of charity and education which they have reared, for many good lessons in morality and self-control which they have systematically endeavored to teach. And yet, although the society was founded expressly to uphold order and respect for authority, as well as to promote learning and works of charity, though its members were to consist of men who are not only true patriots and loyal subjects, but the patrons of science and the friends of all mankind, there is reason to believe that Bacon found the rules of the society and the doctrines of pure deism insufficient to ensure either patriotism or loyalty, insufficient to ensure the attainment of the highest truth or of the greatest good to the greatest number. It is clear that he himself could not endure to remain in this low ground, and he mounted, as we have seen, into the clearest and sublimest heights to which the human intelligence or the human spirit is permitted to penetrate. Not so all his followers, if the scanty gleanings which we have been able to make in this field are of any value. There is reason to think that more than once the harmony of the Masonic brethren has been broken. Selfishness, ambition, and other ills which frail humanity is heir to, and which will not be checked by any code of human laws, by morality, however philosophical. By philanthropy, however well-meaning, seem to have crept in, creating quarrels and ruptures and doubtless in every case, fresh divergence from the original scheme. If we read aright some ambiguous narratives in books which are nothing if not mystical, and which bear marks of being of Masonic origin, there have been not only quarrels but faithless members in the society who, instead of handing down the lamp, which had been consigned to their charge, instead of merely preserving or publishing in due season some work not their own, have clung to it, claimed it, and endeavored to profit by it. Is that true, which such hints in books, endorsed by verbal information, incline us to believe, namely, that the Masons are no longer all true patriots and loyal subjects, and that in some countries at least, mutual toleration in matters of speculative opinion and belief is no longer one of the valuable characteristics of the craft. These, joining to their disrespect for religion, the kindred disrespect for any authority except their own, are applying themselves to degrade, if possible to demolish, all forms of church worship, defacing the beauty of holiness, reducing Christianity to humanitarianism, and landing their followers in a cold agnosticism or a worse spirit of antagonism to Christianity. The causes of atheism are, Bacon says, divisions in religion, scandal of priests, custom of profane scoffing in holy matters, which doth little by little deface the reverence of religion, and lastly, learned times with peace and prosperity. For troubles and adversities do more bow men's minds to religion. They that deny a God destroy man's nobility, for certainly man is of kin to the beast by his body, and if he be not of kin to God by his spirit, he is a base and ignoble creature. It destroys likewise magnanimity and the raising of human nature, and as atheism is in all respects hateful, so in this, that it depriveth human nature of the means to exalt itself above human frailty. Bacon's axiom, thought is free, expressed something very different from irreverent license of thought. Neither did he advocate the idea that the raising of human nature was to be achieved by disregard of the powers that be. The majority of right-minded and loyal Masons are doubtless of his opinion, and it is suggested that the large and increasing number of the members of the Rose-Croix degree may be a tacit protest against the irreligious tendencies of some of the other lodges. It is possible that Bacon perceived the beginnings of such deviations as have been indicated, and that his foresight as to the ultimate issue caused him to make the Rosy Cross the highest and most secret degree, the members forming a community of the ablest and most earnest and influential Christians in the Masonic ranks. Since the statements and opinions of Masonic writers differ, it is of course impossible for a non-Mason to obtain information so accurate as to be incapable of contradiction or refutation. These remarks, therefore, are merely intended to form a basis for further inquiries and researches. No one book must be taken as an absolute authority. For if anything is made plain to the uninitiated student of Masonic literature, it is that comparatively few Masons know much about the true origin and aims of their own society. Books ostensibly published for the purpose of giving information consist, for the most part, of names of persons and lodges, of places and orders, with very scanty notices on any subject which will not be found discussed in ordinary cyclopedias. The Masonic books are palpably constructed so as to disclose nothing of any value. Some contradict others, and doubtless they are only intended to be thoroughly useful to those who have other and verbal information imparted to them. Under these circumstances, the most helpful plan which can be adopted seems to be to ignore recent utterances and to give transcripts from a book whose 9th edition was published nearly 100 years ago and which is still continually referred to in the chief Masonic manuals. The subject is the idea of Masonry, its tenets, objects, and practical works, the place where and the person by whom it was first introduced into England. The reader will judge for himself as to how much or how little of the historical part he will credit. But he may observe that this author tells us nothing of Masonic lodges before the deluge or on the plains of Shinar. The illustrations are in 6 books, of which the first displays the excellence of Masonry and deals with reflections on the symmetry and proportion perceptible in the works of nature and on the harmony and affection amongst other species of things. Whoever attentively observes the objects which surround him will find abundant reason to admire the works of nature and to adore the being who directs such wonderful operations. He will be convinced that infinite wisdom could alone design and infinite power finish such amazing works. Besides the symmetry, good order, and proportion which appear in all the works of creation, something farther attracts the reflecting mind and draws its attention nearer to the divinity, the universal harmony and affection among the different species of beings of every rank and denomination. These are the cements of the rational world, and by these alone it subsists. When they cease, nature must be dissolved, and man, the image of his maker and the chief of his works, be overwhelmed in the general chaos. As to the origin of Masonry, we are told that we may trace its foundations from the beginning of the world. Ever since symmetry began and harmony displayed her charms, our order has a being. It almost seems as if the idea of the extreme antiquity of the order was encouraged by the frequent use of quibbles on the word order. Bacon's aim was to reduce knowledge and all else to a method or order, for order is heaven's first law. In the dark and rude ages of the world, knowledge was withheld from our forefathers, incapable of receiving it. Masonry then diffused its influence. Science was gradually unveiled, arts arose, civilization took place, and the progress of knowledge and philosophy gradually dispelled the gloom of ignorance and barbarism. Next, we read of the advantages of secrecy and of a system of secret signs carefully preserved among the fraternity. A universal language is thus formed and contributes to the union in an indissoluble bond of affection and mutual interest of men of the most opposite tenets, of the most distant countries, and of the most contrary opinions. The Chinese, the wild Arab, the American savage will embrace a brother Briton and will find a stronger obligation than even the common tie of humanity to induce him to kind and friendly offices. As all religions teach morality, if a brother is found to act the part of a truly moral man, his private speculative opinions are left to God and himself. Masonry, we are told, is a term which expresses a double meaning, the work, that is, and the abstract ideas of which that work is the symbol or type. Masonry passes under two denominations, operative and speculative. By the former, we allude to a proper application of the useful rules of architecture, whence a structure derives figure, strength, and beauty, and whence result a due proportion and a just correspondence in all its parts. By the latter, we learn to subdue the passions, act upon the square, keep a tongue of good report, maintain secrecy, and practice charity. Speculative Masonry is so far interwoven with religion as to lay us under the strongest obligations to pay that rational homage to the deity which at once constitutes our duty and our happiness. It leads the contemplative to review with reverence and admiration the glorious works of creation, and inspires them with the most lofty ideas of the perfections of the divine Creator. Operative Masonry furnishes us indeed with dwellings and sheltering edifices, and demonstrates how much can be done to the benefit of man by science and industry. Yet the lapse of time and the ruthless hand of ignorance and the devastations of war have laid waste and destroyed many valuable monuments of antiquity on which the utmost exertions of human genius have been employed. Even the Temple of Solomon, so spacious and magnificent and constructed by so many celebrated artists, escaped not the unsparing ravages of barbaric force. We are arrested by the very Baconian and Shakespearean sentiments and the combination of words in which they are expressed. Not marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme. When wasteful war shall statues overturn and broils root out the work of masonry, nor Mars his sword, nor war's quick fire shall burn the living record of your memory. The monuments of wit survive the monuments of power, etc. We see then how far the monuments of wit and learning are more durable than the monuments of power or of the hands. For have not the verses of Homer continued 2,500 years or more without the loss of a syllable or letter, during which time infinite palaces, temples, castles, cities have been decayed and demolished? But the images of men's wits and knowledges remain in books, exempted from the wrong of time and capable of perpetual renovation. Throughout the Masonic books, the reader is led to suppose that the survival and transmission of Freemasonry is the matter of extremist importance. Read, however, by the light of Bacon, we perceive that the whole object is to get possession of the rude and ignorant, and by working upon their innate vanity, or shall we say their self-respect, to draw them on to works of mutual benefit, and to raise them by gentle stages up the steps of knowledge and morality under the impression that their superiority consists chiefly in the possession of some great and mysterious secret. The lower orders are indeed the stepping stones for the cleverer and more helpful higher initiates. The subscriptions of the vast number of members are of immense value in promoting many useful works, which without some such organization would never have been attempted. And doubtless the members of every degree share in the pleasure and pride which Freemasons evidently take in the numerous charitable works which they have inaugurated and liberally supported. Yet it is much to be doubted if the lower orders of Masons either guess at their own origin or perceive that the true aim of the society is to raise the level of patriotism and morality until the former may fulfill heaven's first law of universal order and harmonious obedience to earthly authority, and the latter shall lift man above the flats of mere worldly wisdom and morality to the sublime heights of divinity or religion, to heights indeed to which probably many Freemasons do not aspire, but are content to live in the valley. The attentive ear, says the Masonic manual, receives the soul from the instructive tongue, and the sacred mysteries are safely lodged in the repository of faithful breasts. Tools and implements the most expressive are selected by the fraternity to imprint on the memory serious truths, and thus the excellent tenets of the institution are transmitted unimpaired under circumstances precarious and adverse through a succession of ages. The fraternity is said to consist of 3 classes, each with distinct privileges. Honor and probity are recommendations to the first class. Diligence, assiduity, and application are qualifications for the second class, in which is given an accurate elucidation of science, both in theory and practice. The third class is restricted to a selected few whom truth and fidelity have distinguished, whom years and experience have improved, and whom merit and abilities have entitled to preferment. We should expect this class to be initiated into some of the mysteries of the printing house, and of the collating room and the ciphers, for in the next section the author enters into a discussion of the objections raised to the secrets of Masonry, which he says are not mere trivialities, but the keys to our treasure. He exhorts his readers not to regard the mysteries or the ceremonials of the order as nominal and frivolous. Those who hurry through the degrees or stages without considering the steps which they pursue, or without possessing a single qualification for the duties which they undertake, are doing a positive injury to the society which they profess to aid, and deriving no benefit themselves, for the substance is lost in the shadow. Then comes an explanation of some of the causes why Masons have, from time to time, brought upon themselves discredit and censure. The very variety of members of which the Society of Masons is composed, and the small number who are really conversant with the tenets of the institution, render it almost certain that some will transgress and prove faithless to their calling. When mild endeavors to reform such persons are fruitless, they are expelled the lodge as unfit members of the society. But no wise man will condemn a whole community on account of the errors of a few individuals. Friendship and social delights cannot be the object of reproach, nor can that wisdom which hoary time has sanctified be subject to ridicule. Whoever attempts to censure what he does not comprehend degrades himself, and the generous heart will always be led to pity the mistakes of such ignorant presumption. In the charge at the initiation into the first degree, the initiate is enjoined never to suffer his zeal for the institution, however laudable, to lead him into argument with those who may ridicule it, but rather extend your pity toward all who through ignorance contemn what they never had an opportunity to comprehend. Charity is next extolled as the chief of every social virtue, and the distinguishing characteristic of the order and of the deity himself. The bounds of the greatest nation or the most extensive empire cannot circumscribe it. It is a godlike disposition, since a mutual chain of dependence subsists throughout the animal creation. The whole human species are therefore proper objects of charity. Further, all kinds of men may in their different spheres prove useful. But the officers of a lodge in Freemasonry ought to be principally restricted to those whose early years have been dedicated to literary pursuits, or whose circumstances and situation in life render them independent. They should also be men of superior prudence and good address, with a tranquil, well-cultivated mind and retentive memory. But he who wishes to teach must be content to learn. A self-sufficient, conceited person, however able, can therefore never be a good Mason. Arrogance and presumption appear not on the one hand, or diffidence and inability on the other, but all unite in the same plan. The second book of Masonry gives an illustration of the ceremonies connected with the opening and closing of a lodge, in which account we seem to see a reflection of Bacon's cogitations on the means of ensuring help from worthy and capable men, who should prepare to guard the entrances and approaches to the Temple of Wisdom. In the first sentence, note the use of his promus entry, avenues. Our care is first directed to the external avenues of the lodge and the proper officers, whose province it is to discharge that duty, execute the trust with fidelity. By certain mystic forms, these officers intimate that it is safe for the ceremonies to proceed, or they detect impostors and unfit persons who must be excluded. The ceremonies are religious and intended not only to remind the master and brethren of their many duties, but also to inculcate a reverential awe of the deity, that the eye may be fixed on that object from whose radiant beams light only can be derived. At the closing of the lodge, each brother faithfully locks up the treasure which he has acquired in his own repository, and pleased with his own reward, retires to enjoy and disseminate among the private circle of his friends the fruits of his labor and industry in the lodge. This paragraph seems to imply that the brethren adopted Bacon's advice regarding the taking of notes, and that they habitually stored up their newly gained treasures of learning in order to add to the common fund, and to distribute them at a later period for the benefit of the world in general. We observe, amongst other peculiarities in Rosicrucian books, the large number of fly-leaves at one or both ends. These, however, in the old volumes have been in most instances cut out. Only one explanation of this singular circumstance seems satisfactory, namely that the brethren, by Bacon's original instructions, took notes of all that they heard or read, and that these fly-leaves or notebooks were thus made the repositories of treasure stored up, so that nothing should be lost, but that ultimately all newly acquired learning should flow into the common treasury. No brother is supplanted or put out of his work if he be capable of filling it. All meekly receive their rewards, and never desert the master till the work is finished. In a lodge, Masons meet as members of the same family and representatives for the time being of all the brethren throughout the world. All prejudices, therefore, on account of religion, country, or private opinion are removed. In the charge delivered at the closing of the lodge, the Masons are instructed to be very cautious in your words and carriage, and that the most penetrating stranger may not discover or find out what is not proper to be intimated, and, if necessary, you are to waive a discourse and manage it prudently for the honor of the fraternity. If a stranger apply, beware of giving him any secret hints of knowledge. The charge ends with renewed exhortations to brotherly love, the foundation and capstone, the cement and glory of this ancient fraternity. In the first Masonic lecture, virtue is painted in the most beautiful colors, and the duties of morality are strictly enforced. In it, the Masons are prepared for a regular advancement in knowledge and philosophy, and these are imprinted on the memory by lively and sensible images, the lecture being suited to all capacities, and necessary to be known by every person who would wish to rank as a Mason. Unhappily for the uninitiated, the author can annex to this remark no explanation consistent with the rules of Masonry, but refers the more inquisitive to our regular assemblies for further instruction. So out goes the candle and we are left darkling. Yet we need not despair, but may believe that by a due study of Bacon's Colors of Good and Evil, and other works based upon it, his advancement of learning and his emblematic and metaphoric language, we may furnish ourselves with all the useful knowledge which the Masonic initiates will gain by their lecture on the colors of virtue, the advancement of philosophy, and the images by which the novices are instructed. Just as the Rosicrucians in the New Atlantis and elsewhere are commanded to dispense their medicines gratis, so Masons are called upon solemnly to declare themselves uninfluenced by mercenary motives, but prompted by a desire for knowledge and a sincere wish of being serviceable to their fellow creatures. They pledge themselves to study the Bible, to consider it as the unerring standard of truth and justice, and to regulate their lives according to its divine precepts. The three great moral duties to be observed are: 1, to God by reverence and submission to his will; 2, to your neighbor by acting on the square and by unselfishness in dealing with him; 3, to yourself by avoiding irregularity and intemperance which might impair your faculties and debase the dignity of your profession. This section concludes with another exhortation to secrecy and caution in recommending new initiates. Next, we come to a page of observations on the origin and advantages of hieroglyphical instruction, a subject which, in view of Bacon's instructions on this very subject, and the evidently close relation which his remarks bear to the illustrations and ornaments of the books published during his life, and with various modifications from that time till now, possesses for the inquirer a strong attraction and interest. Since nothing can be more noble than the pursuit of virtue, nor any motive more alluring than the practice of justice, what instruction, we are asked, can be more beneficial than an accurate elucidation of those symbols which tend to embellish and adorn the mind? Everything that strikes the eye more immediately engages the attention and imprints on the memory serious and solemn truths. Hence, Masons have universally adopted the plan of inculcating the tenets of their order by typical figures and allegorical emblems to prevent their mysteries from descending to the familiar reach of inattentive and unprepared novices from whom they might not receive due veneration. It is well known that the usages and customs of the Masons have ever corresponded with those of the ancient Egyptians, to which they bear a near affinity. These philosophers, unwilling to expose their mysteries to vulgar eyes, concealed their particular tenets and principles of polity under hieroglyphical figures, and expressed their notions of government by signs and symbols which they communicated to their magi alone, who were bound by oath not to reveal them. Pythagoras seems to have established his system on a similar plan, and many orders of a more recent date have copied the example. Every character, figure, and emblem depicted in a lodge has a moral tendency and tends to inculcate the practice of virtue. Here, as will be seen by and by when we come to emblems and hieroglyphic pictures, Freemasons are again adopting Bacon's ideas and doctrines and using his words, though their charm is lost by dilution and paraphrase. No addition or alteration seems to improve either his phraseology or his ideas. Usually the copyists limp after him in what imitation they can borrow. But even where they most craftily prick in or transfer to their own work his beauties of language and quaint conceits, it is still easy to distinguish the original from the imitation, the pearls from the beads, and at least 1/3 of Preston's illustrations is, we believe, taken directly from Bacon, perhaps originally dictated by him. The charge at initiation into the second degree again enforces the study of the liberal arts, especially of geometry, the basis of our art, geometry and masonry, originally synonymous terms being of a divine and moral nature, which, while it proves the wonderful properties of nature, demonstrates the more important truths of morality. It will readily be perceived that here is a double meaning, for geometry does not really teach morality, and no one can believe that the terms geometry and masonry were ever truly synonymous. The next instructions concerning the 5 orders of architecture further confirm the notion that the teaching is symbolic, and that it requires verbal elucidation. The information on architecture is of the most elementary character and converts itself at the end of the second page into an analysis of the human faculties, where we are taught to consider the 5 senses as the gifts of nature, the channels by which knowledge is conveyed. In the treatment of the senses of hearing, seeing, and feeling, the analogies between the bodily organs and the spiritual faculties are ever present to the writer. It is the ear, the gate of the understanding, the eye, the gate of the affections, the touch of nature which makes the whole world kin, which we perceive shadowed in the architectural instructions of Masonry. When these topics are proposed in Masonic assemblies, the brethren are not confined to any peculiar mode of explanation, which probably means that the eye may be interpreted the eye of the mind as well as of the body, that the ear in the same way may be intellectual or physical, that the Masonic signs may be palpable to the eye by symbols, gestures, or marks in printing, engraving, and sculptures, or sensible as they have been found to the touch in the pages or edges of books, that the contents of the books themselves may be tasted, chewed, and swallowed, or their secrets smelt out by discerning initiates. For though the senses are the gifts of nature, reason, properly employed, confirms the documents of nature, which are always true and wholesome. She distinguishes the good from the bad, rejects the last, and adheres to the first. Hearing is the sense by which we can best communicate to each other our thoughts and intentions, our purposes and desires, while our reason is capable of exerting its utmost power and energy. The description of this sense seems to point to the verbal teaching of the Masons. But the sight is the noblest of all the senses. The organ is the masterpiece of nature's work, and the large amount of symbols and metaphors which connect themselves with this sense show the important place which it occupies in Masonic symbolism. Then, by feeling, we distinguish the different qualities of bodies, or, it might be added, of spirits. They are hot or cold, hard or soft, rough or smooth, and have other qualities which are seen to be connected by some original principle of human nature which far transcends our inquiry. Hast thou, says Prospero to Ariel, hast thou, though a spirit, some touch, some feeling of their afflictions? Shakespeare makes great use of the metaphor, the inly touch of love. A sweet touch, a quick venue of wit, the most bitter touch of sorrow. Touched with noble anger, with pity, etc. No one can doubt that Shakespeare, like Enoch, was a good Mason. Surely, too, the eye of the perceptive intellect, the ready ear for truth, in other words, the will, which Bacon says rules thought, free as it is, and the tender sympathy which is in touch with all created nature, are the three senses of hearing, seeing, and feeling which are deemed particularly essential amongst Masons. Then of smelling, that sense by which we distinguish odors, we recall Ovidius Naso smelling out the odoriferous flowers of fancy. The fool's exposition of why one's nose stands in the middle of one's face to keep one's eyes of either side's nose, that what a man cannot smell out he may spy into, with many other similar figures of smelling out villainy at which heaven stops the nose, of the air and smell of the court, of calumny, of sin, offense and corruption, of mortality and heaven's breath. Ariel's graphic description of the effect produced upon the varlets, Trinculo, Stefano, and Caliban by his music shows the tendency throughout Bacon's works to associate many or opposite ideas in such a manner as to make them blend into one harmonious thought. Here all the five senses do their part and are shown to be mutually connected. The men were drinking and striking out, striving to touch something. Ariel beats his labor, and their senses are so confused that they try to see or to smell his music, following it to the detriment of their shins, the sense of hearing beguiling the sense of touch, until they are plunged into the midst of foul-smelling mud. We feel throughout that the author is illustrating his doctrine of the biform figure of nature, showing how a man who takes no pains to cultivate the intellectual and spiritual side of his nature reduces himself to the level of the brutes, to which by his body he is kin. Ari, I told you, sir, they were red-hot with drinking, so full of valor that they smote the air for breathing in their faces, beat the ground for kissing of their feet, yet always bending towards their project. Then I beat my tabor, at which, like ewe-backed colts, they priced their ears, advanced their eyelids, lifted tip their noses, as they smelt music, so I charmed their ears, that calf-like they my lowing followed through toothed briars, sharp furzes, pricking goss and thorns, which entered their frail shins. At last I left them in the filthy mantled pool beyond your cell, there dancing up to the chins, that the foul lake o'erstunk their feet. Lastly, with regard to the organ of taste, which enables us to make a proper distinction in the choice of our food. This sense guards the entrance of the alimentary canal, as that of smell guards the entrance of the canal for respiration. Smelling and tasting are inseparably connected, and it is by the unnatural kind of life men commonly lead in society that these senses are rendered less fit to perform their natural offices. The senses are the channels of communication to the mind, and when the mind is diseased, every sense loses its virtue. In the noblest arts, the mind of man is the subject upon which we operate, and wise men agree that there is but one way to the knowledge of nature's works, the way of observation and experiment. Memory, imagination, taste, reasoning, moral perception, and all the active powers of the soul constitute a proper subject for the investigation of Masons, and are mysteries known only to nature and to nature's God, to whom all are indebted for every blessing they enjoy. In other words, the proper study of mankind is man. and humanity must be led to inquire and to look from nature up to nature's God. Yet it is difficult to see how this dissertation has any true connection with the adjoining passages on architecture, or with those which immediately follow on geometry, the first and noblest of the sciences, the same as symmetry and order, heaven's first law, unless we take the view that all this is the symbolic language. In this section, God is called in Baconian language the divine artist, the great artificer of the universe, the architect of nature. The universe itself is God's vast machine, framed by himself, and through which by geometry we may curiously trace nature through her various windings to her most concealed recesses. In the really poetical and very Baconian description here given of the beauty and order displayed in the various parts of animate and inanimate creation, the writer delights to prove the existence of a first cause. Every blade of grass that covers the field, every flower that blows, every insect which wings its way into unbounded space, the variegated carpet of the terrestrial creation, every plant that grows, every flower that displays its beauties or breathes its sweets, affords instruction and delight. When we extend our views to the animal creation and contemplate the varied clothing of every species, the hues traced by the divine pencil in the plumage of the feathered tribe, how exalted is our conception of the heavenly work. The apt disposition of one part to another is a perpetual study to the geometrician. Even when he descends into the bowels of the earth, he finds that every gem and pebble proclaims the handiwork of an almighty creator. In the sixth section of the second degree, previous utterances, suggestions, and lessons are repeated, still in diluted Baconian terms. Evaporating a little superfluous phraseology, we again come upon familiar exhortations to temperance, fortitude, prudence, and justice. Temperance, which governs the passions. Fortitude, which he who possesses is seldom shaken and never overthrown by the storms that surround him. Prudence, the chief jewel of the human frame. Justice, the bound of right, the cement of civil society, which, in a great measure, constitutes real goodness, and which should be the perpetual study of the good Mason. Virtue, true nobility, wisdom, the channel through which virtue is directed and conveyed. The mind, the noblest subject of our studies. Observation and experiment, the one way to the knowledge of nature's works. Masonry, we are repeatedly told, is a progressive science, including almost every branch of polite learning. The omission implied consists, apparently, in all matters connected with Christianity and the Church of Christ. In fact, if, as we think, Bacon framed these rules, we see that this must be so. For after a dissertation still in Baconian language paraphrased upon geometry, the noblest of the sciences, upon the numberless worlds framed by the same divine artist which roll through the vast expanse conducted by the unerring laws of nature, and of the progress made in architecture, particularly in the reign of Solomon, these instructions finish up with a short explanation of the liberal arts, which are computed by the Masons to be 7 in number. These arts are grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, which includes the doctrine of the spheres, geography, navigation, and the arts dependent on them. Thus end the different sections of the second lecture, which, besides a complete theory of philosophy and physics, contains a regular system of science demonstrated on the clearest principles and established on the firmest foundations. Truly, this must be a wonderful lecture, and it seems quite a pity that the majority of mankind should be excluded from this shortcut to the 7 liberal arts and sciences. Perhaps, however, it only points the way, as Bacon did, to so many studies which ultimately lead to knowledge fitting its possessor for admission to the last and highest degree of initiation. For the third and last lecture consists of 12 sections, composed of a variety of particulars, which render it impossible to give an abstract without violating the laws of the order. Every circumstance that respects government and system, ancient law and deep research, curious invention and ingenious is accurately traced, while the mode of proceeding on public as well as on private occasions is explained. Among the brethren of this degree, the landmarks of the order are preserved, and from them is derived that fund of information which expert and ingenious craftsmen only can afford, whose judgment has been matured by years and experience. To a complete knowledge of this lecture few attain, From this class, the rulers of the craft are selected, and it is only from those who are capable of giving instruction that we can properly expect to receive it. It is then this highest class of Masons that we should confidently expect to find in possession of all the histories of the building and endowing of the great libraries, colleges, schools, hospitals, etc., of which we have elsewhere spoken. We should expect them not only to be able to give account of the origin and builders of these and other structures, gateways, fountains, etc., to ancient houses, tombs and monumental tablets and sculptures of wood carving of pulpits, choir stalls, etc., ironwork also in churches, gateways and old signs, designs in stained windows and ceilings, but we should expect from them a clear and indubitable explanation of the meaning of the peculiar designs and figures which we have observed, not only in buildings but in books. A very brief account of the building of the Temple of Solomon and of the dedication of that edifice follows. We can, says the author, afford little assistance to the industrious Mason in this section, as it can only be acquired by oral communication. A remark which again plainly shows us that the temple to be built is not a mere structure of brick or stone. 2 pages more bring us to an explanation of the 7 liberal arts, of which 5 at least seem to have nothing to do with architecture: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And as these, together with the doctrine of the spheres, are all to be included in one lecture, we may rest satisfied that this lecture is not so profound as its title might lead us to suppose. Here we should be inclined to break off this review of Masonry, because having extracted as much as we can of the pith and meaning and aim of these Masonic mysteries, it seems undesirable to spend time and space upon particulars which apparently have for their object to puzzle and confuse the uninitiated reader, though to the initiated they may perhaps convey some information or reminder. We continue, nevertheless, chiefly for the sake of illustrating a theory set forward in another place, with regard to feigned or disguised histories, records and biographies, and changed names. In Book 3, a short paper is printed which professes to contain certain questions with answers to the same, concerning the mystery Masonry, written by the Handa of King Henry, the 6th of the name, and faithfully copied by me, Joao Leyland Antiquarius, by the command of His Highness. Whether or not this document is what it pretends to be, is not to the present purpose. Our object is to draw attention to the strange footnotes which accompany the questions and which occupy much more letterpress than the document itself. None of these notes appear to be both genuine and necessary. Some contain the elaborate quibbles or puns which were said to be so irresistible to Bacon, but which also, we think, formed a part of the secret and ambiguous language of his society. Others speak of the invention of arts which Bacon suggested or commenced. All include touches of his style. One mentions his name. For instance, footnote turns upon a supposed confusion between Venetia and Phoenicia. Perhaps similitude of sound might deceive the clerk who first took down the examination. Then to the question, how comed yit yn Engelond, we are informed that Masonry was brought by Peter Gower, a Grecian, who after traveling through Egypt and Syria, and every country where the Venetians had planted Masonry, framed a great lodge at Groton. The footnotes again correct this passage at much length. Peter Gower must be another mistake of the writer. I was puzzled at first to guess who Peter Gower should be, the name being perfectly English, or how a Greek could come by such a name. But as soon as I thought of Pythagoras, I could scarce forbear smiling to find that philosopher had undergone a metempsychosis he never dreamt of. We need only consider the French pronunciation of his name, Pythagore, that is Petagore, to conceive how easily such a mistake may be made by an unlearned clerk. The true object of this note seems to be to draw attention to the connection between Pythagoras and the wisdom and religious mysteries of the Egyptians. That he was initiated into several different orders of priests who in those days kept all their learning secret from the vulgar is a hint which seems to point to a similar system in Masonry, and the subsequent remarks about Pythagoras having discovered the 47th book of Euclid, and that he made every geometrical theorem a secret, and admitted only such to the knowledge of them as had first undergone a 5 years' silence, seems to contain a further hint concerning the nature of certain highly scientific systems of Cipher, writing which we have elsewhere found mentioned in connection with the name of Pythagoras. With regard to the Great Lodge, which Pythagoras is said to have founded at Groton, another footnote corrects the error after this fashion. Groton is the name of a place in England. The place here meant is Crotona, etc. From the many masons made by Pythagoras, yn processi of Tierney, the arte past yn Engelonde. In answer to the question, what arte haveth the Maconis tecede mankind? We are told that they taught agriculture, architecture, astronomy, numbers, music, poesy, chemistry, government, and religion, religion. To this, a footnote appends the remark, what appears most odd is that they reckon religion among the arts, and this appears to give another hint of the double meanings and symbolism, and perhaps of the cipher system introduced, then as now, into religious books, pictures, designs, and edifices. But the next note is even more suggestive. In reply to an inquiry as to what the Masons conceal, we learn that they concealed the arte of findinge neue artes. Here our commentator becomes more than usually communicative. The art of finding arts must certainly be a most useful art. My Lord Bacon's Nava Morganum is an attempt towards somewhat of the same kind, but I much doubt that if ever the Masons had it, they have now lost it, since so few new arts have been lately invented and so many are wanted. The idea I have formed of such an art is that it must be something proper to be employed in all the sciences generally, as algebra is in numbers, by the help of which new rules of arithmetic are and may be found. The Masons also are said to conceal the art of keeping secrets, though what kind of an art this may be, the commentator professes not to know. They also conceal the art of changes, but he knows not what it means, and the faculty of abrach. Here he is utterly in the dark. Lastly, Masons conceal their universal language. The footnote to this statement might be supposed to be a mere transcription, either of some rough notes or of verbal instructions given by Bacon himself. An universal language has been much desired by the learned of many ages. It is a thing rather to be wished than hoped for. If it be true, I guess it must be something like the language of the pantomimes amongst the ancient Romans, who were said to be able by signs only to express and deliver any oration intelligibly to all men and languages. Bacon makes many references to the silent language conveyed by pictures or sculptures, but the passage just quoted may contain a hint of the instruction which may be given by dumb shows or stage plays. For it continues, as Bacon does, where, in the De Augmentis, he upholds the benefits derivable from a wise use of the theatre. Yet in all that regards these arts of concealment, there are, to the mind of the present writer, strong hints of a system not so much of secret studies as of secret methods of communication, whether by means of cipher writing, hieroglyphic designs, pantomimic gestures, or double-meaning language. This can only be tested by a comparison of many books in which veiled information of the same kind is to be found. May some industrious reader follow up the subject, which seems to become easier as we plod on. The fourth and last book in this strange little volume professes to give the history of Masonry in England. Whether or not anyone was ever found to believe the statements made in the opening chapters of this history, we know not, but hitherto we have not found them repeated excepting in Masonic dictionaries and manuals. We are to believe that Masonry flourished in England before the time of the Druids, that lodges and conventions were regularly held throughout the period of Roman rule until Masonry was reduced to a low ebb through continual wars. At length, the Emperor Carausius, having shaken off the Roman yoke, contrived the most effectual means to render his person and government acceptable to the people by assuming the character of a Mason. He raised the Masons to the first rank as his favorites and appointed Albinus, his steward, the principal superintendent of their assemblies. Later on, he granted them a charter and commanded Albinus to preside over them as Grand Master. Some particulars of a man so truly exemplary among Masons will certainly merit attention. Albinus was born at Verulam, now St. Albans, in Hertfordshire, of a noble family. Some account of the protomartyr, St. Alban, is then introduced. It ends by saying that St. Alban built a splendid palace for the emperor at Verulam, and that to reward his diligence, the emperor made him steward of his household and chief ruler of the realm. We are assured that this knight was a celebrated architect and a real encourager of able workmen. It cannot therefore be supposed that Freemasonry would be neglected under so eminent a patron. This remarkable and authentic history further enlightens us as to St. Alban's munificence and liberality in paying his servants. whereas before that time in all the land a mason had but a penny a day, and his meat St. Alban mended it, for he gave them 2 shillings a day and 3 pence to their cheer. He also got them a charter from the king. An additional note adds that a manuscript written in the time of James II contains an account of this circumstance and increases the weekly pay to a day for the bearers of burdens. These payments were liberal for the 17th century. For the days of St. Alban, martyred AD 303, the allowance strikes us as remarkable for labouring masons and hodmen. Perhaps we may find 3 shillings and 6 pence per week was the pay for scribes, amanuenses, etc., and 3 pence a day for messengers. The editor of the Royal Masonic Cyclopedia is so considerate as to grant his readers the full use of their faculties in this investigation. To be sure, he complicates it as much as possible by cross-references, but it seems to be the rule rather than the exception to hinder students from attaining any information of value without the exercise of some perseverance and considerable loss of time. Thus, we wish to ascertain the origin of Freemasonry. Finding nothing to the point under Freemason, we try origin of Freemasonry and are more happy. This article summarizes the theories promulgated on the subject. 1. Masonry derived from the patriarchs. 2. From the mysteries of the pagans. 3. From the construction of Solomon's temple. 4. From the Crusades. 5. From the Knights Templars. 6. From the Roman Collegia of Artificers. 7. From the operative Masons of the Middle Ages. 8. From the Rosicrucians of the 16th century. 9. From Oliver Cromwell. 10. From Prince Charles Stuart for political purposes. 11. From Sir Christopher Wren at the building of St. Paul. 12. From Dr. Desaguliers and his friends in 1717. It is hardly necessary, adds this accommodating instructor, to express any opinion on the point. The fraternity has the advantage of being able to choose for itself, and as Masonry is now worked, any decision on the point is as impossible as the value of that decision would be futile. This is discouraging. Nevertheless, we cannot fail to observe that amongst the 12 distinct theories as to the origin of the Freemasons, the legend of St. Alban is omitted. The writer refers us to a previous article on the antiquity of Freemasonry. The words with which this article greets us are doubtless intended to deter us from investigation. On this subject, much has been written to little purpose, and it is not proposed to further discuss them here. That mystical societies nourished long before the dawn of history is not to be denied, but that such societies essentially resembled Freemasonry, it is more than futile to opine. Then the writer goes off into a discussion of hieroglyphics and Egyptian symbolism and speaks of Hiram, Osiris, and Adonis, and of Numa Pompilius, king of Rome. He's not much interested in his own remarks and evidently does not expect anyone else to be so. It is idle to speculate upon such a topic as the antiquity of these secret associations, and it is far wiser to accept the development as being in essentia all that we know upon the subject. Alas, not everyone has so much wisdom as to find bliss in ignorance. We next try Alban, St. Alban. St. Alban, the protomartyr of England, born at Verulam or St. Albans in Herefordshire. He is the reputed legendary introducer of Freemasonry into England, but without much vidance. So the writer takes no heed of all the accurate historic information about the Emperor Carausius, which the past master of the Lodge of Antiquity was so particular in chronicling. We are now referred to a 6th article on Grand Masters of Freemasonry, which opens by again cautioning the reader against putting any trust in the information which is about to be imparted to him. Grand Masters of England before the revival of Masonry in 1717. This list has been collated from several authorities. It is, however, not given as fact but as tradition. Here, the tradition of St. Alban, which in Preston's illustrations is presented as true history, is repeated. The first Grand Master is said to have been AD 287, St. Alban, a Roman knight, when Carausius was Emperor of Britain. Say that the origin of Freemasonry was traditional, yet what need is there to invent an Emperor Carausius? After a sketch of the history of Masonry in England, under St. Augustine, King Alfred, and the Knights Templars, we are gradually made to perceive how, from very early times, the great family of the Pembrokes and the Montagues were connected with, or said to be connected with, Masonry. Roger de Montgomery, Earl of Shrewsbury, is said to have employed the fraternity in building the Tower of London. Gilbert de Clare, Marquis of Pembroke, presided over the lodges in the reign of Stephen, when the chapel, afterwards the House of Commons at Westminster, was built by the Masons. On the accession of Edward I, 1272, the care of the Masons was entrusted to the Archbishop of York, the Earl of Gloucester, and Ralph, Lord of Mount Hermor, the progenitor of the family of the Montagues, who finished the building of Westminster Abbey. Even when we come down to the history of Inigo Jones as a mason and architect of the palace at Whitehall, and of many other magnificent structures in the time of James I, we are reminded that it was to William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, that Inigo Jones owed his education. That by his instrumentality, Inigo Jones was introduced to the notice of the King, nominated Grand Master of England and deputized by his sovereign to preside over the lodges. Again, we read that William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, became warden to Grand Master Jones, and that when the architect resigned, in 1618, the Earl of Pembroke succeeded him and presided over the fraternity until 1630. Others of Bacon's friends accepted office for short periods: Henry Danvers, Earl of Derby, Thomas Howard, Earl of Arundel, and Francis Russell, Earl of Bedford. Then, in 1636, Inigo Jones returned to his office of Grand Master, which he retained till his death in 1646. He designed Wilton House, the seat of the Earls of Pembroke, where there was a private theatre, and where Measure for Measure was first performed by Shakespeare's company, in order, it is said, to propitiate the king at a time when Sir Walter Raleigh was about to be tried for his life at Winchester, and when James I and his suite were staying at Wilton. In the early accounts of Freemasonry, it really appears that the actual building of fair houses or magnificent edifices for public utility or for religious purposes was the sole or chief object and mission of the Masons. Even at these early dates, however, the friends of Bacon's family were apparently always mixed up with the affairs of the society. Long after Bacon's death, the records of Masonry are seen recording the same connection. On the 27th of December, 1663, a General Assembly was held at which Henry Jermyn, Earl of St. Albans, was elected Grand Master, who appointed Sir John Denham his deputy and Mr. afterwards Sir Christopher Wren and John Webb his wardens. We pause in order to draw especial attention to a footnote appended to the name of Christopher Wren. He was the only son of Dr. Christopher Wren, Dean of Windsor, and was born in 1632. His genius for arts and sciences appeared early. At the age of 13, he invented a new astronomical instrument by the name of Pan Organum and wrote a treatise on rivers. It is, perhaps needless to say, no such astronomical instrument is known at the Royal Society. Neither is it mentioned in any other account of Sir Christopher Wren, which we have met with. Although the fact that he was, in 1680, chosen president of that society might naturally suggest some instances of his connection with mathematical science and mechanical inventions. Observe that here is another precocious boy who invents or designs a plan for a universal method, a novum organum. Will anyone produce Sir Christopher Wren's treatise on rivers, or any proof of his having written such a work? In no life or biography of Sir Christopher Wren do we find any of the statements which this work on Freemasonry inserts concerning him, and which, as usual in these cases, are relegated to a footnote. His biographer continues, his other numerous juvenile productions in mathematics prove him to be a scholar of the highest eminence. He assisted Dr. Scarborough in astronomical preparations and experiments upon the muscles of the human body, whence are dated the first introduction of geometrical and mechanical speculations in anatomy. He wrote discoveries on the longitude, on the variations of the magnetical needle, de re nautica veterum, how to find the velocity of a ship in sailing, of the improvements of galleys, and how to restore wrecks. Besides these, he treated on the convenient way of using artillery on shipboard, how to build on deep water, how to build a mole into the sea without putzolan dust or cisterns, and of the improvement of river navigation in joining of rivers. In short, the works of this excellent genius appear to be rather the united efforts of a whole century than the production of one man. Here it will be observed the writer is saying of Sir Christopher Wren the same, in other words, that Dr. Spratt said of Bacon, that though he might not allow him to be equal to 1,000 men, he was at least equal to 20. And looking back at the catalogue of Wren's performances, not only are we disposed to look askance upon statements which come to us in such questionable shape, and which have such a curious affinity with particulars of researches which we do know to have employed the nimble brain and the equally nimble pen of Bacon. But further, since it is pleasant to understand what we read, will anyone inform us as to Putzolan dust? And what can any kind of dust have to do with the building of a mole? Or with cisterns? Is it possible that in Putzolan dust we meet with one of those egregious puns, those quibbles or jests which, according to Ben Jonson, Bacon never could pass by? Was this the dust which is to be cast in the eyes of the mind to puzzle the understanding, or to puzzle the will of man? We read in Rosicrucian works of dusty impressions, of brains which trot through dust and dirt, and the quibble is as well suited to convey its meaning as many others which we find in these and similar books. Perhaps when Ben Jonson said that Bacon never could pass by a jest, he said it with a purpose, to draw attention to these endless ambiguities of speech, the trivial puns which conveyed such weighty meanings. The names of distinguished Masons are well worthy of note. They afford much insight into the connection between certain famous old firms in printing and kindred trades and those of today. It will be seen how many names well known in literature, art and science are Masons, as it were, hereditary, and handing down the lamp of tradition, each in his own line. We have noticed some interesting tombs in connection with this subject, and younger readers are advised, having filled their minds with the symbols of these societies, to keep their eyes open when visiting old churches and churchyards. To return to the point whence we started in this chapter, we find it almost impossible to believe that the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons were separate and totally disconnected fraternities. All evidence showing them as originally one and the same, the Rosicrucians forming the pinnacle to the lower orders of Masons. And although a mass of suggestive evidence has come before us by means of the Rosicrucian books and documents, the more solid historical facts have all been reached by an examination of the old works, which are professedly Masonic. It is more than probable that at some period within 100 years from the death of Bacon, the little knowledge of many of his followers became indeed a dangerous thing, that the puffed, swelling and windy pride which he reprobated took the place of the patient, humble, self-effacing spirit of his first fraternity, and that the free thought for which he labored from curbed license plucked the muzzle of restraint. Instead of exercising a gentle and benign practice of tolerance in matters of religious, ceremonial, or of opinion, the Masons, in many cases, seem to have lost sight of the universality or Catholicity of true faith, their religious principles degenerating into mere abuse and vituperation of the Romish Church, whereas their duty was but to resist and expose its errors and imposture, and the initiation of Roman Catholics, not Papists, was permitted by the laws of the Brotherhood. This violent and intemperate behavior of the Freemasons seems to have produced a rupture, and Freemasonry became not the handmaid, but the enemy and opponent of Christianity, and the result affords a melancholy illustration of the saying of Bacon concerning atheism and its causes. The causes of atheism are divisions in religion, if they be many, for one main division addeth zeal to both sides, but many divisions introduce atheism. Scandal of priests and a custom of profane scoffing in holy matters are also causes which he notes for that atheism which to him is especially hateful, in that it depriveth human nature of the means to exalt itself above human frailty. He quotes the speech of Cicero to the conscript fathers, in which he says that they may admire themselves as much as they please. Yet neither by numbers, nor by bodily strength, nor by arts and cunning, nor by the inborn good sense of their nation, did they vanquish their many powerful antagonists, but through our devotion and religious feeling, and this the sole true wisdom, they having perceived that all things are regulated and governed by the providence of the immortal gods, have we subdued all races and nations. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.